All right, so let's move into flashcard 19, and here we're going to be talking about policy areas. Policy is simply what the government is implementing, laws that they're passing, programs that they're running. And when we talk about Congress, it's really important to talk about the different areas of policy that can be most contentious and most influential, and oftentimes subject to debate and discussion in our political world. So, one of the big things we talk about is the spending of Congress and what they're spending money on in the budget of Congress. And a couple of terms here that are worth noting are the concepts of discretionary spending versus mandatory spending. So, Congress sets a budget every year, and in the budget, only some specific items do they have discretion or freedom to kind of change how much they're going to spend on in each year, how much money is going to be going to certain government departments or government programs. The rest of it is mandatory spending. Okay, mandatory spending is spending that is required by law, and the government can't change how much they spend through the budget process on some of these mandatory programs. And basically, when we're talking about mandatory spending, we're mostly talking about entitlement programs. And by entitlement programs, we mean benefits that Americans are eligible for or entitled to based on certain circumstances, usually their age, but also perhaps income level. So we're really talking about Social Security, which is a retirement pension, but also there are other things that are folded into the Social Security program, such as unemployment benefits. And then we have the Medicare. Medicare is health insurance for the elderly population, and these are incredibly expensive programs. I should also note Medicaid is health insurance for low-income individuals or families, and although that's administered by states, money from the federal government is actually expended given to the states so they can spend it on Medicaid. These programs cost enormous amounts of money, and people say that when we talk about our federal budget, we are really talking about a small relative sliver of what the government actually controls. If they wanted to change Social Security and Medicare, they have to pass laws. They can't do it through just changing the expenditures and saying we're not going to spend as much money on this, because people are entitled to this benefit. So entitlement programs are very controversial in Congress, because if you want to solve the budget situation that we have, where we have huge debts and deficits, then you have to whittle away at entitlement costs, and that can be very unpopular because people benefit from them, and in some cases they need these programs. Now, as we go through, speaking about expenditures, it's also worth noting that we are sometimes talking about fiscal policy, and occasionally we talk about monetary policy. So when we're talking about fiscal policy, we're really just talking about the government's ability to set policy for taxing and spending. What's the tax code going to be? Who's going to pay what? And then what's the government going to spend money on? So, when politicians come in and they say, I want to cut taxes, or I want to raise taxes on the wealthy, or whatever it is you may hear them say, they're talking about making changes to fiscal policy. Or if they want to have spending programs, they want to spend money on health insurance, they want to spend money on infrastructure. That's expenditure, that's fiscal policy. Monetary policy is another branch of government economic policy that's not controlled by Congress as much. It's a little bit more indirectly controlled by Congress. Monetary policy is talking about the value of money and the controlling of the money supply. And that's something that's typically done through the Federal Reserve, which is a bureaucratic agency. It's created by Congress, but the president appoints the chair of the Federal Reserve Board, and the Senate, of course, confirms that person. But that group actually somewhat acts independently. So they set the government interest rate, which they can then kind of loan money to banks at certain rates, and that interest rate can trickle out into the main economy and influence how much people have to pay for loans. They can also determine what is the money supply. Do they want to inject currency into the economy? And there are different ways for them to do that. So Congress has less control over monetary policy, but they have a lot of control over fiscal policy. So if they want to influence the economy, then fiscal policy is going to be the main lever that Congress uses. And when they're engaged in fiscal policy, they're talking about things related to the debt and the deficit. Debt meaning that the total amount of money that is owed by the U.S. government is our debt, which is in the right now in 2020 about $27 trillion. The deficit is simply the annual budgetary amount of debt that's added to the total debt. So if we run a deficit from year to year, $1 trillion or another $1 trillion or $2 trillion, then that gets added to the total debt. Certainly, we could run a surplus. We haven't done that for quite some time. It hasn't been since the 1990s. But just understanding the difference between those terms and influencing the budget, debt, and deficit, really that's a fiscal policy, not a monetary policy issue. Now, some of these things we've been talking about, entitlement programs and government debt and deficit and fiscal issues, they can lead to gridlock. People debate over, for example, how much debt we should have and be accumulating. They debate over how much spending we should be doing, whether we should be having Congress pass certain huge spending bills and to relieve people from the economic hardships of the pandemic, but people disagree on it. And we have divided government very frequently in the United States, and Congress in particular. When at least one part of the Congress is of a different party than the president, we have divided government. And when you have divided government, you tend to have gridlock because the parties don't view issues of entitlement spending. They don't view issues of debt and deficit, of fiscal policy. They don't see eye to eye. And so, the parties are very polarized. And people are in their different camps, and it seems to be getting worse and worse because of gerrymandered districts, because of the advantages of incumbency. And so, we have gridlock in the U.S. political system today where change happens very, very slowly. And so these are important concepts to understand when we talk about Congress, the way Congress is set up and the way the American people have chosen their representatives over the past few cycles here to establish divided government more often than not leads to gridlock and stagnation in Congress, which can frustrate a lot of people. Now, part of the frustration is the fact that when Congress is setting their seats, when Congress conducts a Senate and then reapportion seats every 10 years, so different states might lose or gain a congressman depending on population shifts. Then they often engage in the state level in the process of gerrymandering. So just a couple of terminology issues here. Apportionment is simply the concept of dividing the members of the House of Representatives by state according to population. So, for example, Massachusetts has 9 members of the House of Representatives. California has 53, and Wyoming has 1. And so they're all based on how many people live in those states. Every 10 years, that gets reapportioned. So, in the previous census in 2010, Massachusetts lost a congressman. We had 10, we went to 9, and here in 2020, maybe there will be shifts in different parts of the country. A few states will gain, a few states will lose. But when they do gain or lose, or just even every 10 years in general, they can redraw congressional districts. And when they draw these congressional districts, the party in charge typically draws them in a way, in most states, that benefits their party. So it makes it more likely that members of their party will win elections in congressional seats. So they draw the lines of the congressional districts. And we've talked about this class, and we looked at visuals in class. So I don't want to go too deep into it because I know we've looked at it. But they draw really funny-looking districts to either spread out their opponents, the opposition party, into as many districts as possible, or to cram them into as few districts as possible so that you can kind of give your opponents a couple of districts and spread your own support out around as many districts as possible to maximize the benefit. I would encourage you to go and take a look at our resource page on gerrymandering. We had a little video there and some exercises we did, but this is incredibly controversial. People say it's just simply not democratic because it increases polarization. It makes for fewer competitive districts. Now, when we talk about districting, there are limitations on the way districts can be drawn and what state legislatures can do. So the first thing I'll point out is the Supreme Court case, a required case for this course, Baker versus Carr, which basically is a case in which there were unequal-sized districts. And the Supreme Court was trying to determine in the 1960s whether or not unequal-sized districts could be brought to the federal courts, and whether or not, in essence, in Baker versus Carr, they're asking, is this something that the federal courts have control over, how states draw their districts? And the answer was yes. Okay, so the constitutional clauses here are going to be the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. That's primarily going to be the clause in Baker versus Carr. The 14th Amendment says no state will take away equal protection of the laws. And so if you have districts that are of unequal size, then people have unequal voting power in their voting representatives for Congress. So it really sets the precedent of, and this is important, one person, one vote. You know, the idea that unequal sized districts can be heard by the court, and they can be struck down by the court, and that the court can impose requirements on one person, one vote, because it's not equal, because of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. And that's an amendment we'll explore in other units as well. So it's an enormously important precedent in the 1960s. In the 1990s, in Shaw versus Reno, they heard a case about a gerrymandered district in North Carolina, and they ruled that when the district was gerrymandered based on racial characteristics, they tried to put as many African Americans in a district as they possibly could to create a majority-minority district. And the question was, can race be used can race be used as a characteristic when drawing congressional districts? And the precedent here says no. The precedent is that, again, it's an Equal Protection Clause case. Are people being treated equally under the law? The decision is no, they cannot. Okay, so racial gerrymandering is unconstitutional. It's a violation of the 14th Amendment. It's controversial. You know, some people argue that there may be good motives involved in this. They're trying to increase representation of a minority group, but the courts are going to say that nonetheless, it's treating people unequally, and race can't be used as a criteria. You have to use other criteria when you figure out how to draw these districts. A couple other terminology concepts we worked through, and I'll just kind of go through them quickly. Lame duck congressmen and presidents. So a lame duck session of Congress is after a election, but before the next Congress is seated. They tend to have less power. And a lame duck president, same thing, after a presidential election, but before the inauguration of a new president. That outgoing president tends to have a small amount of power. So when we talk about elections in Congress, you know, we're talking about lame duck sessions that happen after those. So Congress can have different power at different times, different amount of power. They typically have the most power earliest in their presidency or congressional session. When congressmen and women, just a few more slides, make decisions about how to vote and how to kind of view their role as a member of Congress, they can view themselves as either a trustee, a delegate, or a politico. And a trustee is someone who they go to Congress and they view their role as having been entrusted to make the decisions that they think is best, because that's what their constituents would want them to do. So, you know, their constituents vote them in, and then they make the decisions they think is best. A delegate says, no, I'm going to just do what my constituents want. I'm just going to, conduct polls, call them, listen to them, read their mail, and if this is what they want me to do, I'll vote on this issue in this way. But really, most congressmen and women are politicos, in which, depending on the political situation, they may choose to vote one way or vote another. They'll act as a trustee or a delegate in different circumstances, depending on what the political needs are of themselves for re-election or party support, or so on and so forth. And along the lines of, they're going to have to figure out what's needed to gain support. Log rolling is the concept of vote trading, the concept of when congressmen are making votes and making decisions. Sometimes they'll have to think about the broader issues that are out there in Congress and what other congressmen and women want. So if you're engaged in log rolling, then you're voting for what might benefit a different congressman or a different congressperson's district you don't really care about. In return, that congressman or women might vote on a bill that you care about. So there's this kind of vote trading going on. So, it's a big Congress, and people talk, and people kind of can work out agreements and arrangements. And, this is a way that legislation gets done, for better or for worse. And for better or for worse, I'll end with pork barrel spending, which is something you read about with a reading. And it's the idea of bringing home the bacon, the idea that congressmen and women can get provisions inserted into legislation that will bring money back to their specific districts, whether it's a military base, whether it's a grant to a specific college or university, or an infrastructure project in their district, congressmen and women, they can get these things, provisions inserted into legislation. Some people argue that it's just abject corruption and bribery, and it's wasteful spending. And other people argue that pork barrel spending is something that kind of greases the wheels, so to speak, and makes tough legislation easier to pass. Maybe people wouldn't necessarily vote for things without pork, and maybe laws wouldn't get passed as much. And also I should mention it's a major incumbent advantage. Incumbents, when they're running for re-election, they have advantages. They have the gerrymandering. They have the pork barrel spending. They have the name recognition. They have access to the media. They have all these advantages we've talked about throughout. And the pork barrel spending is one of those. And it really leads to the fact that incumbents seem to get reelected over and over again. And it's very difficult to unseat an incumbent. So this is the end of our flashcards. And a reminder at the end, just like at the beginning, this is supposed to be a quick review. We've done all sorts of other things in class and explored many of these in more depth. So make sure you look at all the resources we have. Ask me questions, and good luck.